Edgar Whitlock slammed the debt notice onto the counter so hard that the ink jar rattled off the edge and shattered on the floor. 30 days, he said, loud enough for every ear in the saloon to catch it. 30 days, Bridget Rowan, and I take the land, the mule, and whatever sorry excuse for furniture you've got left in that shack. The room went quiet. Not the respectful kind of quiet. The kind where people hold their breath because they want to watch something bleed. Bridget stood there, all 260 pounds of her, in a dress that had been mended so many times the patches had patches. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She just looked at Edgar Whitlock the way a woman looks at something that has already done its worst and failed to finish the job. And that was the moment Silas Crow walked through the door. If you've ever been laughed at for believing in the wrong person, keep watching. Because what happened next changed everything. Before we go further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels, and if it moves you, hit that like button. Every single one tells me to keep going. Now. Let's go back to the beginning. The morning it all started, Silas Crow had been awake since before the darkness thinned. That was nothing unusual. Trappers who slept past first light didn't stay trappers for long. They became cautionary tales instead, frozen in a ravine somewhere north of the timberline, with nothing but regret and a sprung trap to show for the winter. Silas had been running that mountain for 11 years, and in 11 years he had learned that the difference between surviving and not surviving was almost always about paying attention before anyone else thought there was anything worth paying attention to. He rode into Blackstone Crossing just after 7 in the morning with his pack mule loaded down with winter pelts, fox, beaver, a few mink, and one black bear hide that alone would fetch enough to keep a man comfortable until the leaves came back. The total haul was the best he'd had in 4 years. He'd counted it 3 times on the trail because he didn't quite believe it himself. He wasn't a man given to celebration. He wasn't given to much of anything that could be called soft. He stood 6'2" and carried the kind of lean muscle that comes from actual work rather than showing off about it. His beard had grown wild through the winter and he hadn't troubled himself to do anything about it. He had a scar along his left jaw from a trapping accident in his second season on the mountain that had never healed quite straight, and both his hands were scarred at the knuckles from cold and rope and 100 different kinds of hard use. People in Blackstone Crossing mostly left him alone. That was fine with him. He did his business, sold his pelts to the trading post, bought his supplies, settled any debts from the previous season, and then he left. Clean and simple. He preferred it that way. He had just tied his mule at the post outside the general store when he heard the noise coming from across the street at Dunbar's saloon. It wasn't fighting noise. He knew fighting noise. This was something different. A low, collective sound, like a crowd settling in to enjoy something at someone else's expense. Silas probably should have walked into the general store, done his business, and ridden back out of town the same way he always did. He didn't. He crossed the street. The saloon was about half full for that hour of the morning, which said something about Blackstone Crossing that wasn't entirely flattering. Miners, a few ranch hands, 2 men in traveling clothes who looked like they wished they were somewhere else entirely. Behind the bar, Cal Dunbar was polishing a glass with the focused expression of a man who had decided very deliberately not to be involved in whatever was happening in the middle of his floor. Edgar Whitlock stood at the center of it. Silas had dealt with Edgar Whitlock exactly twice before, and both times had left him with the distinct impression that here was a man who had discovered early in life that other people's suffering could be made to pay, and had built his entire existence around that discovery. He ran the largest dry goods operation in the valley, controlled half the supply routes coming in from the south, and held paper on more debt in Blackstone Crossing than any bank within 300 miles. He was not a large man physically, maybe 5'9" on a generous day, soft around the middle, with small, quick eyes the color of muddy creek water. But he had learned to make up for his physical unremarkability by ensuring that everyone in any given room understood exactly how much they owed him. The piece of paper he had slammed onto the counter was still lying there when Silas stepped through the door, and Bridget Rowan was still standing exactly where she'd been, not backing up, not breaking down, just standing there the way a tree stands in wind, rooted by something you can't see. Silas had seen Bridget Rowan around town over the years, the way you see certain people around a small town, regularly enough to recognize, rarely enough to not know much. He knew she was a widow. Her husband, A farmer named Thomas Rowan had died 3 winters back from a chest sickness that had moved fast and left no room for argument. He knew she had a piece of land up on the eastern slope, 50 acres of rough ground that most people in town had already written off as worthless. He knew that since Thomas died, she had been trying to work that land alone, and he knew, because in a town this small everyone knows everything, that she had been falling further behind on her debts every season. What he had not paid close attention to, because it had not been his business to pay close attention to it, was the way people talked about her. He understood it now, watching the room. They thought it was funny. That was the part that hit him somewhere between the ribs like a dull blade. They weren't just indifferent, they were entertained. The 2 men in traveling clothes were whispering to each other with small smiles. One of the ranch hands had actually turned his stool around to get a better view. Even Cal Dunbar, for all his deliberate neutrality, had a particular quality of attention to his glass polishing that suggested he was listening hard. "You've had the notice since September," Edgar was saying, in the pleasant tone of a man who was enjoying himself without wanting to look like he was enjoying himself. "I gave you the extension in November out of the goodness of my heart. Now it's March, the debt's grown by 14% interest as agreed, and I'm afraid goodness has its limits." "I know what month it is, Mr. Whitlock," Bridget said. Her voice was steady. Silas noticed that. He noticed that she had the kind of voice that didn't shake even when the rest of her probably wanted to. "Then you know the 30-day clock starts today." He picked up the notice and held it out to her between 2 fingers, the way you'd offer something to a dog you weren't sure about. "Sign the acknowledgement." "I'm not signing anything until I've had it read by someone who isn't employed by you." There was a little ripple of reaction in the room. Not in her favor, just the low murmur of people who were surprised she had the nerve. Edgar's pleasant expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went flat and cold for just a moment. "That's certainly your right," he said. "Sign it or don't. The clock runs regardless." He folded the notice, tucked it into his coat pocket, and looked around the room with an expression that invited everyone to share in the joke. The joke being, apparently, Bridget Rowan herself. What she'd tried. What she'd failed at. What she looked like standing there in her patched dress trying to act like she had options when everyone in the room knew she didn't. 2 men at a back table were already quietly laughing. Silas walked to the bar. He didn't fully understand what he was doing or why. He could have told you that he'd been on a mountain alone for 5 months, that he was tired, that he was maybe not in the most measured state of mind for financial decisions. He could have told you all of that. He didn't think about any of it. He put both hands on the bar and spoke loud enough to carry. "What's the total?" he said. Edgar turned. The room shifted. Cal Dunbar set down his glass. "I beg your pardon?" Edgar said. "Bridget Rowan's debt. What's the full amount? Principal? Interest? All of it?" Edgar looked at him for a moment the way you look at someone when you're trying to figure out if they're serious or stupid or both. "That's a private financial matter between—" "Is it on public paper?" Silas said. "It's been filed at the—" "Then it's public." He pulled his pack off his shoulder and set it on the bar. "What's the number?" The room was completely quiet now, even the men at the back table. Edgar named a figure. Silas looked at him. Then he looked at Bridget. She was staring at him with an expression that was almost impossible to read. Not hope, not exactly, because hope was something she'd evidently learned to keep in a very small and protected place, but something cautious and watchful, the way you'd look at a fire before you decided whether to move toward it or away from it. He opened his pack. What he pulled out were the season's takings. Not all of it, but most of it, tallied and organized from his transaction at the trading post that morning before the noise across the street had changed his plans. He'd been paid in a combination of currency and trade scrip that he'd been intending to deposit. He laid it out on the bar. It was, to the dollar, within 12 cents of Edgar Whitlock's number. The silence in the room had a different quality now. It wasn't the entertained quiet of before. It was the stunned quiet of people who could not quite make their minds fit around what they were seeing. "That covers it?" Silas said. Edgar stared at the money. Something was happening behind his small, muddy eyes, calculations, rapid and uncomfortable. He could say no. He could claim the figure was wrong. But there were witnesses in this room, and Edgar was many things, but he was not stupid enough to commit open fraud in front of a saloon full of people. "It covers it," he said, flat, stripped of the pleasant tone entirely. "Then we're done here." Silas looked at Cal Dunbar. I'll need a receipt, 2 copies. Bridget hadn't moved. She was still standing in the same spot. Silas looked at her and for the first time that morning wasn't entirely sure what to do with himself, because what he'd just done was the kind of thing that required some kind of explanation, and he was not a man who was particularly good at explanations. I'm not offering charity, he said. He said it quietly, not for the room, just for her. I'm not the kind of man who does that, and I don't expect you'd want it anyway. She looked at him. Then what are you doing? He thought about it for a moment, actually thought about it, visibly, which was not something most people in that room had ever seen. Edgar Whitlock allow another person to do without prompting them to hurry up. That land of yours on the eastern slope, he said. I've been watching that pass for 2 seasons. The freight traffic coming down from the northern territories has doubled. There's not a single proper way station between the high pass and the valley floor, not one with hot food, covered shelter, and space for large caravans. He paused. I think that land could be the most valuable 50 acres in the mountain corridor, and I think you know it too, or you wouldn't still be holding on to it. The room was listening now, not with amusement anymore, with something more complicated. Bridget said nothing for a long moment. He could see her thinking, not the quick reactive thinking of panic, but the careful, deliberate thinking of a woman who had learned, probably through considerable pain, not to let things move faster than she could actually see them clearly. You want a partnership, she said. Equal shares, equal say. I've got the capital and the construction knowledge. You've got the land and, from what I just watched, the backbone. He held out his hand. It's not a sure thing. I could be wrong about the past traffic. We could build the whole thing and have it fail. You could also be doing this to get the land out from under me once I owe you instead of Whitlock. He didn't flinch. Yes, I could be. She looked at his hand. Then she looked at his face. Whatever she found there, whatever it was she was measuring with that careful, cautious intelligence, something settled in her expression. Not quite trust. Not yet. Something more like a provisional decision to find out. She took his hand and shook it. The laughter started at the back table and spread like a grass fire, fast and contemptuous, men who had already decided what this was and what it would come to. Someone said something Silas chose not to hear clearly. Someone else repeated it louder. Bridget looked at the room, and for just a moment her composure had a hairline crack in it, not because of the laughter itself, but because of what it cost her not to answer it. Silas picked up his pack. You want to show me the land? He said. She looked at him again. Now? I just spent my whole winter. He almost smiled. Almost. I'd like to see what I spent it on. She turned and walked toward the door without another word to anyone in the room. He followed her. Behind them, the laughter was still going, comfortable and certain, the laughter of people who were absolutely sure they knew how a story ended before it had barely started. Edgar Whitlock watched them go. His hands, down at his sides, were very still. His face had arranged itself back into its usual pleasant expression. But those small, muddy eyes were doing something else entirely. Outside, the March wind came off the mountain sharp and clean and cold enough to hurt. Bridget pulled her coat tighter without complaint. She was walking 2 steps ahead of him, not waiting, not adjusting her pace, just moving. The way a person moves when they've been doing everything alone for so long that walking beside someone else is a thing they've almost forgotten how to do. Silas matched her pace and didn't try to move ahead of it. They walked without talking for almost a full minute before she said, without looking at him, You know, half this town thinks you've lost your mind. Half this town thinks a lot of things, he said. She glanced sideways at him. Doesn't that bother you? He considered that. I spent 5 months alone on a mountain. I got used to not having an audience. Something in her face shifted. Not a smile exactly, but the ghost of the thing that comes before one. It was brief, and she didn't let it develop into anything, and he didn't make the mistake of commenting on it. They walked on toward the eastern slope. Behind them, Blackstone Crossing went back to its morning business, already telling the story the way it wanted to be told. The crazy mountain man, the fat widow, the money thrown away on nothing. The story was already fixed in their minds, beginning and middle and end, all of it obvious, all of it certain. Not one of them could have imagined, standing there that morning with their certainty wrapped around them like a warm coat, that they were wrong about every single part of it. The 50 acres didn't look like much. That was the honest truth of it. And Silas Crow was not a man who made a habit of lying to himself about honest truths. He stood at the edge of the property line that first afternoon and looked at what Bridget Rowan had been holding on to through 3 years of widowhood, mounting debt, and the kind of public mockery that would have driven most people to simply give up and leave. And what he saw was rough ground, a broken-down fence line along the northern edge, one collapsed outbuilding that had probably been a stable at some point in its life, and 50 acres of rocky eastern slope that the rest of Blackstone Crossing had collectively decided was worth exactly nothing. But the pass was there. That was the thing. You had to know how to look for it, and most people didn't bother looking because most people had already made up their minds. But if you stood at the right angle on the upper quarter of the property and looked north-northwest, you could see the natural cut through the ridge where the freight road came down from the high country. And more importantly, you could see that there was no shelter between that cut and the valley floor. Not a barn, not a lean-to, not a single place where a man with a loaded wagon and a team of horses could stop when the weather turned without gambling his life on it. "How long have you known?" Silas asked. Bridget was standing a few feet away with her arms crossed, not against the cold. The posture was too deliberate for that, but in the way of someone who has spent a long time bracing themselves against things. "Since the second winter after Thomas died," she said. "I watched a freight caravan try to make the whole run from the pass to Blackstone Crossing in one push because there was nowhere to stop. Lost 2 horses and a wagon wheel in the dark. Driver told me afterward he'd have paid any reasonable price for 4 walls and a hot meal somewhere in that middle stretch. And you didn't—" He stopped himself because the end of that sentence was going to be something like "do anything about it." And the obvious answer to that was standing right in front of him in a patched coat, and he wasn't the kind of man who asked questions he already knew the answers to just to make himself feel informed. "I didn't have capital," she said flatly, in the tone of someone finishing a sentence they've finished many times inside their own head. "I had land and an idea and a dead husband's debts. That combination doesn't get you very far." Silas looked back at the property. He walked the upper quarter of it without saying much, testing the ground with his boot where it looked soft, eyeing the tree line for timber quality, calculating angles and distances with the particular instinct of a man who had spent more than a decade reading terrain for survival. Bridget walked with him. She didn't explain things he hadn't asked about. She didn't try to sell him on what he was already seeing. She just walked alongside him and let him look. He found that he respected that. When they came back down to where they'd started, he said, "The lodge needs to go on the flat ground just above that second rise. High enough to be visible from the pass road, sheltered enough that the north wind doesn't tear it apart in January." He paused. "We'll need good timber. The spruce up on the upper third of the property will do for framing if we take it right." Bridget looked at him. "We're actually doing this." "You shook my hand." "I know I shook your hand. I'm not backing out." She looked at the property, the way people look at things they've been staring at so long they've stopped seeing them clearly, and then something shifted in her expression. Not quite wonder, but close. The particular look of someone who has been carrying a vision alone for so long that having someone else see it too is almost disorienting. "I just want to know you understand what we're walking into. This town is going to be watching us fail every single day." "I know." "Edgar Whitlock is not going to forget this morning." "I know that too." She studied him for a moment. "You're not worried." "I didn't say that." He picked up a rock from the ground, turned it in his hand, set it down. "I'm worried about the north wall framing. I'm worried about getting the roof structure up before the first hard freeze. I'm worried about sourcing enough iron hardware because the nearest blacksmith who does quality work is 30 miles south." He looked at her. "Edgar Whitlock I can deal with. He's just a man." Something crossed her face that he couldn't quite name. Then she said, "All right, where do we start?" They started the next morning. The first 2 weeks were the kind of work that doesn't look like progress from the outside and feels like drowning from the inside. Clearing the site, pulling stumps, moving rocks that had no business being as heavy as they were. Silas had hired 2 men from the valley, brothers named Deke and Warren Pruitt, who were competent enough and didn't ask too many questions. But the work went slower than he'd calculated, because the ground on the flat above the second rise turned out to have a shelf of granite about 18 inches below the surface that they hadn't anticipated, and that took the better part of 4 days to work around. On the third day, one of the Pruitt brothers said something under his breath that Silas didn't hear clearly, but that made the other one snicker, and both of them looked at Bridget in a way that made the back of Silas's neck go tight. He didn't say anything immediately. He watched. Bridget was moving a section of timber, not dragging it, actually lifting and repositioning it, which was a thing that had visibly startled both Pruitt brothers on the first day, because she was stronger than she looked, or rather she was stronger than people who had already decided what she was expected to look like were prepared to see. She set the timber down exactly where she wanted it and turned around, and whatever she saw in the brothers' expressions, she absorbed without reaction and went back to work. That evening, after the Pruitts had gone back toward town, Silas said, "If either of those two gives you trouble, tell me." Bridget was checking the tension on a temporary guide rope. She didn't look up. "I've been handling men like that since I was 19. That's not what I asked." She looked up then. There was something in her expression that was neither grateful nor dismissive, more like the careful assessment of someone deciding how much to let in. "If it becomes actual trouble," she said, "I'll tell you." He accepted that. I wasn't sure he would have accepted it from someone else, but he'd seen enough in the 2 weeks they'd been working together to know that Bridget Rowan's judgment about what constituted actual trouble was not the kind of judgment you second-guessed lightly. She had opinions about everything, strong ones, clearly reasoned, sometimes delivered in a tone that didn't leave much room for debate, and on about half of them she was simply right. The other half were things where they argued, and twice the argument had ended with Silas changing his approach because her reasoning was better than his pride, and once it had ended with him holding his position because he'd been doing mountain construction long enough to know things you couldn't learn from logic alone. She accepted that too, without gracelessness. They were not friends. It was too early and too complicated for that. But they were something. Some particular kind of functional unit that didn't have a clean name, but that both of them understood without having to discuss it. What they didn't discuss, also without having to agree to it, was the degree to which Edgar Whitlock had already begun making their lives more difficult. The first sign was the lumber supplier. Silas had arranged, before that morning in the saloon, to purchase a load of milled lumber from a mill operation 20 miles south that he'd used before and trusted. 3 days after the handshake with Bridget, the mill owner sent a rider with a message that the order was canceled. No explanation. When Silas rode down personally and asked, the man wouldn't meet his eyes. "Got a prior commitment I forgot about," the mill owner said, staring at a point somewhere past Silas's left shoulder. "Can't help you." Silas rode back and started sourcing their own timber from the property. It was more work. It was slower. The lumber wouldn't be as clean as milled stock. He told Bridget that evening. She listened, and then she said, "Whitlock." "Almost certainly." She was quiet for a moment. "What else can he do?" "Hardware. Labor. If he gets to the right people before we do, he can make it very hard to source what we need." He paused. "He can also spread stories. Make sure nobody in this valley takes us seriously, which he's probably already doing." "He's been doing that for 3 years," Bridget said, with a flatness that had something old and tired in it. "The stories are nothing new." Silas looked at her. In the weeks they'd been working together, he had begun to piece together, from the things she said and the things she didn't say, what the 3 years since Thomas Rowan's death had actually looked like from the inside. It wasn't pretty. There had been a period after the funeral where she'd been offered help by people who had then used that help as a reason to feel entitled to her decisions, her time, her gratitude. And when she'd declined to be managed, the help had dried up and the stories had started. She was ungrateful. She was proud. She was foolish for trying to work that land alone. And under all of it, running like a cold current beneath every interaction she had in Blackstone Crossing, was the simple fact of what she looked like, the size of her, the way she moved, the space she took up in the world, and the way this particular town had decided that was a thing to be commented on, laughed about, dismissed. I didn't say anything about any of this because he didn't know how to, and because he suspected that having it named out loud by someone else was not what she needed. What she needed was exactly what they were doing, getting up every morning and going to work. By the end of the 4th week, the foundation work was done, and they had begun framing the main structure. This was where something shifted. Silas had framed buildings before, 3 trappers' cabins over the years, 1 small trading outpost up near the timberline that had stood through 6 hard winters, but nothing on this scale. The lodge as Bridget had designed it, and she had designed it, with a specificity and spatial logic that had surprised him, even though by this point it probably shouldn't have, was a substantial structure. Main hall with a central fireplace large enough to heat a full room of travelers. 6 private rooms along the east wing. A covered stable attachment along the north wall. Kitchen with a rear supply entrance. A small office just off the main entrance where accounts could be settled privately. The design was functional and smart, and it used the natural shelter of the slope in a way that would make the building significantly warmer in winter than a standard box structure. When he'd asked her how she'd worked that out, she'd looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has been underestimated so many times that surprise at not being underestimated has its own distinct texture. Thomas and I lived in a drafty house for 6 years, she said. I spent those 6 years figuring out what I would have done differently. The framing went up faster than Silas expected, partly because Bridget was genuinely useful in ways that went beyond what he'd anticipated when he'd made the handshake. She was strong, not in a qualified way, not strong for her size, or strong for a woman, just strong, with the particular sustained strength that comes from years of physical necessity rather than any kind of exhibition. She could hold a beam in position while he secured it faster and more steadily than either Pruitt brother. She made decisions on the fly when he wasn't there, and they were almost always the right decisions. When there was a structural question she wasn't sure about, she said so instead of guessing, which was a quality he valued more than almost any other in a person. She also had a memory for detail that bordered on unsettling. She knew exactly how much of every supply they had on hand at any given moment, could quote figures from their accounts without looking at anything, and twice caught arithmetic errors in invoices from suppliers that had not been accidental. "You've been counting things your whole life," he said one evening, not as an accusation, just as an observation. "When you don't have enough," she said, "you learn to know exactly how much you have." The 5th week was when Edgar Whitlock made his first public move. He didn't do it himself. He had people for that kind of thing. Specifically, in this case, a man named Cole Ritter, who ran a small freight operation out of the southern end of Blackstone Crossing and who owed Edgar significant money and significant loyalty in roughly equal measure. Ritter showed up at the site on a Tuesday morning with 3 other men, none of whom Silas recognized. He walked around the perimeter of what was already a substantial framing structure, taking his time, while Silas watched from the upper level where he'd been working on the roof joists, and Bridget stood on the ground below. "Quite a project," Ritter said finally, in the tone of someone who has prepared what they're going to say in advance and is now deploying it. "Ambitious." "Yep," Silas said. Ritter looked at Bridget. He had small features arranged in a way that gave his face a permanently skeptical expression. "You know there's a county ordinance about commercial structures on unincorporated land? Needs a signed certification from the district land office." Bridget said, "We filed for certification 6 weeks ago. It's in process." Something flickered in Ritter's expression. He hadn't expected her to know that. "Process can take a while," he said, "especially if the application has errors." "It doesn't have errors. That's for the land office to determine." He walked back around the structure one more time, his 3 companions trailing him with the particular uselessness of people whose job is to make a group look larger. Then he said, to Silas this time, as though that were the more natural address, "There are folks in this valley who think this whole thing is going to end badly. Might be worth considering whether you want to cut your losses while you still can." Silas looked at him from the upper framing. He was genuinely busy. He had 12 more joists to set before the light went. "Appreciate you coming by," he said, in a tone that did not appreciate anything, and went back to work. After Ritter and his men left, there was a silence on the site that lasted about 2 minutes. Then Bridget said, from below, "He's going to try to stall the certification, probably, which means we might be in a position where we've built the structure but can't legally open. Also probably," he said another joist. "Can you get to the land office in person before the end of the week?" "I can go tomorrow." "Take the original copies of everything. Make them look you in the face when they tell you there's a problem." She didn't answer immediately. He looked down and she was looking up at him with an expression he was beginning to recognize, the one where she was deciding whether something he'd said was practical advice or something else. "You think that makes a difference?" she said. "Me being there in person. I think some people will delay a piece of paper indefinitely and won't delay a person standing in front of them asking a direct question." She considered that. "And if they do delay?" "Then we figure out the next thing." He met her eyes. "We always figure out the next thing." Something moved across her face that wasn't quite a smile, more like a decision being reinforced. She nodded once and went back to work. She went to the land office the next day. Silas kept the Pruitt brothers working on the wall planking and spent the day on the roof structure and tried not to think about it. She came back in the late afternoon with the certification. He was on the ground when she rode up. She dismounted, pulled the paper from her coat, and held it out without ceremony. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. How? The clerk is a woman named Mrs. Hargrove, who's been at that office for 22 years and has no particular reason to do Edgar Whitlock any favors. Bridget folded the paper back into her coat. I asked her directly if there was a problem with our application. She said no. I asked her if anyone had contacted the office to suggest there might be a problem. She looked at me for about 5 seconds and then stamped the certification. Silas was quiet for a moment. You're good at reading people. I've had a lot of practice reading people who were trying to manage me, she said, and something in her voice had an edge that wasn't directed at him but that he felt the presence of anyway. The certification changed the mood on the site. Not dramatically. There was still too much work and too many problems for anything like optimism to get completely out of hand. But there was a particular kind of energy in the following week that hadn't been there before. A momentum. The kind that comes when you've been pushing against something and it moves, even slightly. The roof went up in pieces over the following 2 weeks, and it was during this period that Silas and Bridget fell into what you might call, though neither of them would have used the word, a rhythm. She started arriving at the site 20 minutes before the Pruitt brothers each morning and spent those 20 minutes walking the structure, checking the previous day's work, making notes in a small book she kept in her coat pocket. He started arriving 10 minutes before that, not because he'd planned to, just because the camp he'd set up on the northern edge of the property was close, and old habits of early rising were hard to break. They developed the particular shorthand of people who work closely. Half-finished sentences that the other person completed, a look across a distance that communicated something a spoken word would have taken too long to deliver. It was not comfortable exactly, because neither of them was built for comfortable, and there was still too much between them that hadn't been said, and probably wouldn't be for a long time. But it was functional in the way that a well-made tool is functional. Nothing wasted, everything serving its purpose. One evening, in the 7th week, after the Pruitts had gone and the light was going gold along the ridge, Bridget sat on a stack of framing lumber, eating the end of a piece of bread and looking at what they'd built, and Silas sat a few feet away doing the same thing. My mother told me I'd never amount to anything because I wasn't pretty enough to make a good match and too big to be useful for anything delicate, she said, without particular emotion, the way you say something you've said enough times inside your own head that the feeling has mostly worn smooth. She wasn't cruel about it. She just thought she was being practical. Silas didn't say anything. Thomas saw something different, she said. He wasn't much. He wasn't particularly smart or particularly strong, but he saw me as something worth seeing, and that mattered. She paused. When he died, I thought that was probably gone. The being seen part. Silas was quiet for long enough that she looked at him. He said, "What you designed for that main hall. The way the fireplace drafts to the ceiling and the bench layout along both walls. I've been in lodge halls that professional builders planned for 20 years, and none of them thought of that." She looked at him for a moment. I know it's not the same thing, he said. I'm just saying what I see. She turned back to the structure. A long silence. Then, we're going to need to start on the interior walls this week if we want the kitchen functional before October. I know. And we need to talk about the stable attachment. Tomorrow. She nodded, ate the last of the bread, stood up and dusted her hands on her trousers. She was halfway to her horse before she said, without turning around, "Thank you, Silas." He didn't answer because the moment didn't need an answer, and because some things land better in silence. He watched her ride out toward the eastern road. The structure stood behind him in the late light, rough and unfinished and real, the walls not perfectly plumb, the roofline carrying one slight deviation on the western end from a framing miscalculation they'd caught late and had to work around rather than fix. Imperfect in the way that things built by actual human beings in actual difficult conditions are always imperfect. But standing. What Silas did not know, sitting there in the fading light, was that Edgar Whitlock had spent the previous 3 days in quiet conversation with 2 men who had come down from the northern territories and who were not freight drivers, and not miners, and not any kind of honest traveler. What Edgar Whitlock was doing while Silas and Bridget built their walls and set their roof timbers and fell into the particular rhythm of two people making something real from nothing, was making plans of his own. And Edgar's plans had never once in his life included the possibility that someone he'd already dismissed might find a way to make him wrong. That was going to be his most expensive mistake. The 8th week was when the town stopped laughing quite so easily. It wasn't one single thing that changed it. It was the accumulation, the way the structure had risen week by week from that rocky slope, visible now from the freight road that came down through the pass. Visible, in fact, from a considerable distance if you knew where to look, which more and more people were beginning to. Travelers coming down from the northern territories had started slowing their wagons when they passed the turnoff to the eastern slope, craning their necks at what was taking shape up there. A few had stopped entirely and asked the Pruitt brothers what was being built. Word had traveled the way word travels on a frontier road, imprecisely but persistently, passed from one freight camp to another, distorted a little with each telling but carrying a consistent core. Somebody was finally putting up a proper way station on the mountain corridor. In Blackstone Crossing, this information landed differently depending on who received it. For most of the town, the laughter had not stopped. It had simply become slightly less certain, in the way that a joke becomes less funny the longer it goes on without reaching its punchline. People who had been absolutely confident that Silas Crow had lost his mind back in March were now quietly recalibrating, not willing to admit it publicly, but doing the private arithmetic that people do when reality starts diverging from their predictions. The saloon conversations about the crazy mountain man and the fat widow had tapered off, replaced by a watchful kind of silence on the subject that was, in its own way, more telling than the laughter had been. For Edgar Whitlock, the information landed like a stone in standing water, creating ripples that spread outward in every direction and that he could not stop once they'd started. He had tried the lumber supplier. He had tried Cole Ritter and the certification gambit. He had spent 3 weeks quietly working every contact he had in the valley, dropping suggestions here and there that the project was financially unstable, that the partnership between Crow and the Rowan widow was bound to collapse, that anyone who did business with them was taking on unnecessary risk. Some of it had stuck. 2 hardware suppliers had declined Silas's orders without explanation. A man who had agreed to do the chimney stonework had backed out the week before he was due to start, sending a message through an intermediary that he'd taken another job. None of it had stopped the building. That was the part Edgar could not fully accept. He had applied the kind of pressure that had, in his experience, reliably broken things, isolated people, dried up their resources, made the social and economic cost of continuing too high to bear. It had worked on Thomas Rowan. It had worked on a dozen other small operators in the valley over the years. The mechanism was simple and it was effective. Make a person feel alone enough, and they stop fighting. But Bridget Rowan had already been alone for 3 years. She had already had everything dried up. She had already paid every social cost that Edgar could impose, and she was still standing on that slope every morning before the sun cleared the ridge, working until the light went. And Silas Crow, Edgar was beginning to understand, was not a man who had ever particularly cared about being liked by the right people. The 2 men from the Northern Territories were named Cord and Dix. Edgar had not asked for their last names, and they had not offered them, which was a professional courtesy everyone in the transaction understood. They came with a recommendation from a contact in the freight business, who occasionally needed things accomplished that were outside the normal scope of freight operations, and they had a straightforward reputation. They were reliable, they were not given to unnecessary escalation, and they finished what they were paid to finish. Edgar met with them in the back room of his dry goods store on a Wednesday evening, with the front doors locked and the lamp turned low. "The structure is nearly complete," he told them. "It needs to not be complete. That's the whole of it." Cord, who was the one who did the talking, said, "Fire? Preferably. The other one on site? The trapper?" "He's camping on the property." Edgar folded his hands on the table. "I don't want anyone hurt. That's not what I'm paying for." Cord looked at him for a moment. "Then we wait until he's asleep." "Wait until you're certain." They agreed on a figure. Edgar paid half in advance. They shook hands in the particular way of a transaction that could never be written down, and then they left through the rear entrance, and Edgar Whitlock sat alone in his back room for a while, listening to the quiet, and told himself that this was simply business, that he had not created the situation, That Crow and the widow had forced his hand by refusing to recognize the natural order of things. He was good at telling himself things like that. He had years of practice. Silas almost missed it. That was the part that stayed with him afterward. The nearness of it, the way the whole thing had almost gone the other way before it started. He was tired in the 8th week in a way that had become structural, the kind of tiredness that gets into your bones and stays there regardless of how many hours you sleep. The push to get the roof fully sealed before October had driven the pace hard for the past 3 weeks, and he'd been running on the particular fuel of someone who has a fixed deadline and a defined amount of work between himself and it, which is a fuel that burns clean but burns fast. The night it happened, he had turned in earlier than usual. His camp was set back about 60 yards from the main structure on the northern edge of the property, a canvas shelter with a decent bedroll that he'd been operating from since the start. He was asleep by 9, which was early for him, and was in the deep part of sleep by 10, which was unusual. What woke him, he couldn't have said precisely. It wasn't a sound, or not exactly, more like the absence of the particular nighttime sounds he'd been sleeping in the presence of for 8 weeks. The insects. The small wind through the timber on the upper slope. When those things stopped, something in the back of his brain registered the change before the rest of him caught up. He was sitting up with his hand on the rifle beside his bedroll before he was fully awake. He lay still for about 20 seconds, which was long enough to hear the thing that wasn't right. A low, irregular sound from the direction of the structure, soft and inconsistent, with a quality that took him another 3 seconds to identify. Liquid. Someone was pouring something. He came out of the tent without a lamp. He didn't want a lamp. He moved across the 60 yards of open ground between his camp and the structure in the dark, going wide to the left to come at the south side of the building where the sound had seemed to originate. And what he saw when he came around the corner of the stable attachment was 2 men moving along the base of the exterior wall with a can, and the smell of what they were spreading hit him before anything else. Lamp oil, the particular heavy smell of it, and already pooling against the base of the wall, planking in a way that the right spark would turn into something you couldn't stop. He had his rifle up before either of them saw him. "Set it down," he said. Quiet. Not shouting. The kind of voice that doesn't need volume to communicate what it means. The one closest to him, a man he didn't know, solid through the shoulders, in a dark coat, turned and in the same motion pulled a revolver from under his arm. He was fast. Silas granted him that. But Silas had spent 11 years making decisions on a mountain in the dark, with something that wanted to hurt him somewhere in the vicinity, and the response time developed by that kind of life is not something you acquire in any other way. He stepped inside the arc of the revolver before it came level and took the man down with 2 efficient movements that were not gentle and were not intended to be. And then he was standing over him with the revolver in his own hand and the rifle still in the other, while the man on the ground worked on deciding whether to breathe or fight, and correctly selected breathing. The second man had backed up against the wall of the stable attachment. I was holding his oil can still, which was either very stupid or meant he was scared enough that his hands had stopped taking instructions from his brain. He was younger than the first, mid-20s maybe, with a patchy beard and eyes that were doing rapid calculations about how bad this could get. What happened next was a thing that Silas had not planned and could not fully explain when he thought about it later. There was a sound from inside the stable attachment, the door coming off its latch, and Bridget Rowan came through it with a length of fence post in both hands, and the expression of a woman who had made a decision very quickly and was fully committed to it. She had not been sleeping in the stable attachment. She had been sleeping in the interior kitchen of the lodge, which she had started doing 3 weeks ago when it became clear that riding out and back to town every morning was costing them too much time. Silas had known this and had not commented on it. The fence post was from a stack of spare timber they kept inside the south wall. The young man with the oil can looked at her coming through that door and made a decision that Silas could not fault. He threw the oil can down and put both hands up. She stopped 2 feet in front of him. She was breathing hard, not from exertion, not from that short distance, but from the particular adrenaline of waking to a smell you recognize as dangerous and knowing what it means. She had the fence post raised, and she looked at the young man with a flatness in her eyes that made him back against the wall despite having his hands already up. "Don't," Silas said. She looked at him. "We need him talking," Silas said. "Not bleeding." A long moment. something working through her face that was not simple. The anger was real, and it was right, and they both knew it, and the effort to hold it required something that wasn't just self-control, but something more like active decision-making in real time. She lowered the fence post slowly until the end of it rested on the ground, and she kept both hands on it, and she kept looking at the young man with those flat eyes. Silas said to the young man, "Who sent you?" The young man said nothing. "You're 23 years old," Silas said, estimating. "Maybe 24. You're standing here with your hands up and a plan that didn't work, and a man on the ground behind me who's going to have a headache for a week. I am not angry." He paused. "She is angry. Who sent you?" The young man looked at Bridget, back at Silas. He licked his lips. "Whitlock," he said. "Edgar Whitlock. He found us through a man named—" "I don't need the chain," Silas said. "I need the source." "Whitlock. That's the truth. He paid Cord. That's him on the ground. Half up front, half when it was done. Told us to burn the building and make sure the trapper was asleep first." He swallowed. "We were told nobody was supposed to get hurt." Bridget made a sound. It wasn't a word. It was the specific sound of someone hearing something that confirms what they already knew and finding it no less infuriating for the confirmation. Silas looked at the man on the ground, who had recovered sufficiently to be sitting up with his back against the building and his hands visible, doing the same kind of calculations the younger one had done and arriving at the same conclusions. I was bleeding from his nose. Silas's elbow had connected with his face in the takedown, and he was breathing carefully, the way you breathe when you suspect a rib is cracked. "You're going to get up," Silas told him. "You and your partner are going to leave this property and leave the valley. Tonight." He crouched down to the man's level. "If you go to the sheriff and tell the truth, you implicate yourselves along with Whitlock. I'm not telling you what to do with that. But if I ever see either of you on this property again, I will not be in this mood." The man looked at him for a moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not respect exactly, but the particular recognition of someone who has correctly identified the nature of the thing they're dealing with. He got up slowly, picked up his coat, and said to the younger one, "Come on." They left through the south edge of the property into the dark without looking back. Silas and Bridget stood in the space they'd left behind. The oil can lay on its side near the base of the wall, and the smell of what had been poured was still there, sharp and wrong against the timber. He bent and picked up the can and handed it to her without saying anything, and she understood and set it upright, and they spent the next 10 minutes with water from the sight barrel washing down the base of the wall where the oil had pooled. Neither of them spoke much during this. There wasn't much to say that the work didn't say better. They worked with the particular focused quiet of people who have just had something very clear confirmed about the world and are processing it through their hands because their mouths haven't caught up yet. When it was done, Silas stood back and checked the wall in the darkness, running his hands along the base planking, checking for any spot where the oil had already penetrated the grain deeply enough to be a lingering risk. The wood was new enough that it had taken less than he'd feared. Bridget was standing a few feet away. He could hear her breathing, still faster than normal, slower than it had been. "He paid them to burn it," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "While you were asleep." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "If you'd slept a half hour longer." "I didn't." "I know you didn't." She turned to look at the structure. The walls they'd framed, the roof they'd sealed, the kitchen she'd been sleeping in for 3 weeks because the ride back to town was too costly in time. "I want to go to the sheriff." Silas was quiet. "Don't tell me it won't work," she said. "I know it might not work. I know Whitlock has relationships there. I want to go anyway." He looked at her. "All right. Because if we don't put it on record, he'll try again. He might try again regardless. Then at least it's on record when he does." She picked up the fence post from where she'd set it against the wall. "We go in the morning, first thing." He nodded. Then he said, "You knew something was wrong tonight before you came through that door." She looked at him. "I smelled the oil." "Even through the kitchen walls?" A pause. "I've been sleeping light for 2 weeks," she said. "I knew something was coming. I just didn't know when." He absorbed that. "You should have told me." "You knew too," she said. "That's why you woke up." He couldn't argue with that. They were both people who had learned, through different routes and different kinds of loss, to listen to the part of themselves that registered threat before the conscious mind articulated it. It was one of the things they had in common, though neither of them had named it that way. They went to the sheriff in the morning. Sheriff Dale Pruitt, no relation to the Pruitt brothers on the work crew, though the similarity in names was a small ongoing annoyance, was a man of about 55 who had been in Blackstone Crossing long enough to know where all the weights and pressures in the valley lay. He listened to Silas's account with an expression that gave nothing away, made notes in his ledger, and asked several precise questions about the two men's descriptions and the direction they'd left the property. He did not ask about who had sent them. Silas noticed that. When they were done, Pruitt leaned back in his chair and said, "I'll look into it." Bridget said, "Mr. Pruitt, we have two witnesses, both of us, and a direct statement from one of the men that Edgar Whitlock contracted them for this." "One man's statement," Pruitt said gently, in the tone of someone who is not going to be rushed. "One man's statement is a starting point," she said. "It is," he agreed. He looked at her steadily. "I said I'll look into it, Mrs. Rowan. I meant it." Whether he meant it or whether he didn't was something they couldn't know yet. What they could know was that it was on record. Silas had insisted on that. Watching Pruitt write the full account in his ledger, the date, the names, the description of the oil cans, the statement attributed to the younger of the two men. Whether Pruitt followed it anywhere or not, the record existed. And in a valley where Edgar Whitlock had operated for years, partly through the confident assumption that his operations left no record, that alone had value. They rode back to the site in a silence that was not uncomfortable. The morning was cold, a specific kind of cold that Silas recognized from years of mountain living. The cold that isn't just weather, but is weather changing, the beginning of something larger moving in from the north. He said, "October in 3 weeks." She looked at the sky. "I know. We need the kitchen fitted out and the fireplace draws tested before the first hard freeze. If people are going to start relying on us for shelter, we need to know that fireplace actually works the way you designed it. It'll work. I know it'll work. I want to confirm it works." She almost smiled. "You're a careful man." "I'm alive," he said. "Careful men tend to be." The next 3 weeks had a different quality than anything that had come before. Part of it was the near miss of the fire. The way something like that changes the air around a project, makes the stakes visible in a way they'd been abstract before. Part of it was the approaching weather. But part of it was also something that had shifted between the two of them on the night they'd stood in the dark washing lamp oil off the base of their wall, and neither of them had fallen apart. They worked harder. Not because they hadn't been working hard before, but because the work had changed character. It was no longer theoretical, no longer a project that might or might not become real. It was a structure with walls and a roof, and a kitchen and a fireplace, and a sheriff's report with their names on it, and a man named Edgar Whitlock who had paid to destroy it, which meant it was real enough to be worth destroying, which meant it was real. The interior walls went up in 9 days, Silas pushing the pace, Bridget matching it, and in some stretches exceeding it, the Pruitt brothers working longer hours than they'd contracted for, because somewhere in the past 3 weeks they had crossed the invisible line from hired labor to something closer to invested, though Deke Pruitt would have denied this if anyone asked him directly. The fireplace test happened on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of September. Silas built the fire himself, working methodically, while Bridget stood in the center of the main hall watching the ceiling and the far walls with the focus of a person who has designed something and is about to find out if the design actually does what she believed it would. The draw started slow. For about 2 minutes, Silas watched the smoke behavior with the particular tension of someone who knows too well that what seems right in theory can fail in practice in ways you didn't anticipate. Bridget didn't say anything. She just watched. And then the draft established itself, clean and strong and pulling exactly the way she'd calculated, the heat spreading along the ceiling in the direction of the bench walls, warming the room from the top down in a way that would, in a full room of travelers in January, make the difference between endurable cold and genuine warmth. Silas straightened up and looked at her. She was looking at the ceiling with an expression he had never seen on her face before, unguarded, briefly, in a way that most of her expressions weren't. Something that was not triumph exactly, and not relief exactly, but was some combination of the two that had underneath it the deeper thing. The particular satisfaction of having believed in your own judgment through all the reasons not to, and being proven right. She caught him looking, and the expression closed back down into something more familiar. "The north bench wall still needs the seat planking," she said. "I know." "And the office partition." "Wednesday." She nodded, turned back to the fire, then said quietly, not looking at him, "It works." "It does," he said. Outside, the wind off the mountain had taken on the particular quality that Silas had been watching for. Not the sharp cold of early fall, but something sustained and heavier, the kind that carries snow behind it at distance. The first of it would be here in days, not weeks. Back in Blackstone Crossing, Edgar Whitlock had received no report from Cord, and no word from anyone that a certain structure on the eastern slope had met with an unfortunate accident. He had waited 4 days before accepting, with a cold and private fury, that something had gone wrong. He did not know the details. He could not ask for them without exposing himself further. He was left with only the confirmed fact that the building was still standing, that Silas Crow and Bridget Rowan were still on that slope working every day, and that the window he'd had to stop them was closing with every hour. He might have 2 more attempts in those final 3 weeks, both through legitimate channels this time, because the other kind had failed and had now created a risk he hadn't intended. He contacted the county assessor about the property valuation. He had a lawyer in the Valley draft a letter suggesting a technicality in the land certification. Both came to nothing. The certification held. The assessment was accurate. Every door he pushed at had, somehow, already been braced from the other side. The last nail went in on the 4th of October, on a morning when the sky had turned the particular hard gray that means the mountain is about to make its intentions clear. Silas drove it himself, on the north exterior wall, and when it was in, he stood back and looked at what they had built. It was not beautiful in any conventional sense. The lines were honest rather than graceful. The timber had weathered unevenly in places where the early autumn rains had hit it before the exterior ceiling was complete, and there was still the slight deviation on the western roofline that had never been fixed. It was the kind of building that would improve with age rather than decline with it, the kind that said something true about the people who had built it. Not that they were perfect, but that they were serious and had meant what they'd set out to do. Bridget came and stood beside him. They stood there for a while, the two of them, looking at it. The cold wind moved through the site and took the last of the sawdust with it. "Edgar Whitlock is going to come at us again," she said. "Not as a fear, as a statement of known fact." "Probably," Silas said. "We'll handle it." "Yes," he said, "we will." From down the freight road that came through the pass, they could both hear it, the sound of wagon wheels, the low call of a driver to his team, the specific acoustic quality of a large caravan descending from the high country. Travelers of the season, pushing to get down before the weather closed the pass. Bridget looked at Silas. He looked at her. "I'll get the fire started," she said, and turned and walked through the front door of Summit Haven Station for the first time with actual purpose. Silas stood outside a moment longer, listening to the caravan coming down the mountain toward them. The sky above the ridge had gone the deep, loaded gray of a storm that had made up its mind. He went inside and closed the door against the coming cold. The first caravan that pulled into Summit Haven Station was a freight outfit out of the Northern Territories. 7 wagons, 14 horses, and a crew of 11 men who had been on the road for 9 days and who had the particular hollow-eyed exhaustion of people who had pushed themselves past the point where food and rest feel like options and into the territory where they feel like rumors. Their trail boss was a broad man named Hector Gill, who had been running freight through the mountain corridor for 16 years, and who had, in those 16 years, developed a comprehensive distrust of anything that looked too good to be true on a mountain road. He pulled his lead wagon to a stop in front of the station and sat on the box for a long moment, looking at the building with the specific skepticism of a man who has been disappointed by frontier infrastructure before. Bridget came out through the front door. She had a lamp in one hand because the early dark was coming fast under the storm clouds, and she was wearing her working clothes, which were not impressive, and her hair was not arranged in any particular way because she had not had time for that, and had not thought about it. She stood on the front step and looked at Jill and his crew the way she looked at everything, straight on, without fuss. "You looking for shelter?" she said. Jill looked at her. He looked at the building. He looked at the covered stable attachment along the north wall. "What are you charging for the horses?" 2 cents a head per night, hay included. Water's from the creek. "Hot food?" Stew tonight. Bread, coffee. Jill was quiet for a moment, doing the arithmetic. Then he said, You got room for 11 men? 6 private rooms and bench space in the main hall. Blankets for the hall. Another pause. He looked at the building once more, in the assessing way of a man who knows what frontier construction looks like when it's been done right versus when it hasn't. And what he saw in the wall lines and the roof and the covered stable was something he hadn't expected from a way station he'd never heard of before today. He climbed down from the box. All right, he said, we'll take it. What happened over the next 3 hours was the thing that Bridget had been calculating in her head for 3 years, and that Silas had believed in on the basis of freight traffic numbers and a cold assessment of geography, but that neither of them had been able to fully imagine until it was actually happening inside the building they had built. 11 men who had been cold and hungry and past their limit for 2 days sat down in the main hall of Summit Haven Station and ate hot food in front of a fireplace that worked exactly the way Bridget had designed it to work. And the sound in that room was not the sound of a transaction. It was the sound of people who had been outside the circle of warmth and shelter finally getting back inside it. And there is no other sound quite like that in the world. Silas handled the horses. He was good with animals in the practical, unromantic way of someone who has spent years depending on them. And he moved through the stable efficiently, checking legs and hooves without being asked, spotting the off-front shoe on Gil's lead horse that was about to go loose and mentioning it to the driver without making a production of it. The driver looked at him with the particular gratitude of someone who has just been saved a problem before it became one. Bridget managed the inside. She moved between tables with the efficiency of someone who had been running the logistics of a household on no margin for years. And what that experience had given her, which no amount of training could have replaced, was the ability to read what a room of people needed before they said it. The man at the end of the bench who needed his cup refilled before he asked. The young driver who hadn't eaten enough and was trying to hide it. The one crew member who sat separate from the rest, not from unfriendliness, but from something private, and who needed to be left alone rather than attended to. After the crew had eaten and the horses were settled, Hector Gill sat across from Bridget in the small office just off the main entrance and settled the account. He looked at the numbers she wrote in the ledger, accurate, clean, no hidden additions, and then he looked at her. Been through this corridor twice a year for 16 years, he said. Always had to push straight through from the pass to Blackstone Crossing because there was nowhere to stop. Lost a horse to exhaustion 3 years back doing that run. Bridget said, I know. A driver told me about it. That's partly why we built this. Jill looked at her for a moment. He had a way of looking at people that was straightforward without being aggressive. The look of a man who had learned through long practice that direct assessment was more efficient than social performance. Who built it? My partner and I. She paused. Silas Crow. The trapper? Among other things. Jill nodded slowly. I'll tell every outfit I know about this place, he said. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was a statement of practical intent, the way freight men express approval. You'd better be ready for more of us. She looked at him steadily. That's what we built it for. He left the next morning with all 14 horses reshod. Silas had found the loose shoe problem on 3 more animals during the overnight, and his crew fed and rested in a way that showed in how they moved. The particular different quality of people who have slept rather than people who have survived. Gil shook Silas's hand at the wagon, and then, after a brief pause, shook Bridget's, which was not a thing he did habitually, and which he did with the slight awkwardness of someone performing a gesture that felt right, even if it wasn't yet automatic. They watched the caravan pull back onto the freight road and disappear north around the first bend. Then Silas said, "Second night," and went back to work on a loose board on the stable entrance that had been bothering him. Bridget went inside and cleaned the main hall and started on bread for the next day. That was how it began. The first week brought 3 caravans and a group of 7 independent miners heading up toward the high country for a late-season run before the passes closed. The miners were a harder group than the freight crews, men who existed on the outer edge of social convention by choice, who were variously rude, demanding, or simply so accustomed to fending for themselves that basic human consideration had become optional. 2 of them made remarks on the first night that Bridget absorbed without response, and that Silas noted from across the room with the quiet attention of someone who is deciding whether something requires action. On the second night, one of the miners, a wide man with a red beard who had been testing the limits of things since he arrived, said something to Bridget as she refilled his coffee that was not ambiguous in its intent. Bridget set the coffee pot down on the table. She looked at him. "You can pay the full week in advance right now," she said, "or you can collect your things and sleep in the cold. Those are the two options." The man looked at her. He outweighed her, which was not easy, and he had the posture of someone who was accustomed to the weight being a conversation ender. But Bridget's expression was the expression of someone for whom the calculation was already complete and who was simply waiting for him to understand it. From across the hall, Silas had not moved. He was sitting by the north wall, doing nothing in particular and making no approach. But he was watching, and the watching had a quality that the red-bearded miner correctly identified as relevant to his options. The man paid in advance. After that, the miners were not exactly polite. That would have been too strong a word. But they were manageable. Word moved through the group in the way it moves through groups of men who have spent time in rough conditions together, which is to say without much being said explicitly, but with everything being understood. The second week brought more people and a problem. The problem was inventory. Bridget had stocked the kitchen with what she'd calculated would last 3 weeks at projected occupancy, and the actual occupancy in the first week had run 60% higher than the projection, which meant they were going to run short of flour and salt and a particular cured meat that had become, without anyone planning it, the default protein in the evening stew. She laid the numbers out for Silas on the morning of the 8th day, with the directness of someone who does not believe in softening logistical problems. "We need a supply run," she said. "Blackstone Crossing or south to Merritt's Fork. Blackstone is closer." Silas looked at the numbers. "Whitlock controls the main dry goods in Blackstone Crossing." "I know. He's not going to sell to us at reasonable prices if he'll sell to us at all." "I know that too." She closed the ledger. "Merritt's Fork, then. It's 30 miles, but there are 2 suppliers there and no Edgar Whitlock. I'll go today." "We both need to go. I need to inspect what we're buying." She looked at him. "The Pruitt brothers can handle a day." They rode to Merritt's Fork and back in a day and a half, pushing the pace both directions, and came back with a full wagon load of supplies at prices that were fair. Not charitable, but fair. The prices of suppliers who understood that a new regular customer was worth treating correctly. On the road back, with the wagon loaded and moving well, Bridget sat on the box beside Silas and did the arithmetic in her head on what the first week had actually generated versus what they'd spent. And the number was better than she'd expected, and she didn't say anything about it for about 5 miles. Then she said, "We're going to be all right." Silas kept his eyes on the road. "I know. I mean financially. We're going to be solvent by November." "I know." She looked at him. "You're not going to say anything?" "What would you like me to say?" She shook her head slightly, something between frustration and something else. "Most people would express some reaction." "Most people projected I'd lost my mind in March," he said. "I don't generally use most people as my reference point." She was quiet for a moment. Then she laughed, a real laugh, brief and a little surprised at itself, the kind of laugh that happens when something catches a person off guard. He hadn't heard her laugh before. It was a good sound. He kept his eyes on the road. By the 3rd week, Summit Haven Station had become a known fixture on the mountain corridor in the way that useful things become known, not through announcement or reputation building, but through the simple mechanism of people arriving, being treated well, and then telling the next person they met on the road. The word that spread was specific, which was more powerful than word that was general. The fireplace actually heats the room. The food is hot, and there's enough of it. The horses get proper attention overnight. The prices are what they say they are with nothing added. That last part in particular was not something frontier travelers were accustomed to. The effect in Blackstone Crossing was visible by the 5th week. Freight caravans that had previously stopped in town for an overnight rest were now bypassing it entirely, coming up to Summit Haven for shelter and continuing south in the morning without ever pulling into Blackstone Crossing at all. A merchant who operated a small provision store on the main street, not affiliated with Whitlock, just an ordinary businessman trying to manage, came up to the station one afternoon and asked Bridget quietly if she would consider stocking a few of his goods for resale to travelers. She said she'd think about it. She thought about it for 2 days and then said yes, with terms that were specific. His prices had to be fair, she had final say on what was stocked, and she would take a 10% margin. He agreed without much argument, which told her she could probably have asked for 12% and gotten it, and she filed that away. Silas watched this interaction from a distance and didn't offer an opinion because she hadn't asked for one and because it was, by any measure, a good decision made with clear eyes. What Edgar Whitlock was watching during these weeks was something he could not quite process. He had tried to price it out, had sat in his back room more than once, and attempted to quantify exactly what was happening to his business and how fast. The freight traffic was the most obvious part. He had a side business in supplying and stabling freight caravans overnight, which was not his primary income, but which had been reliable for years, and it had declined by something close to 2/3 since October. The provisions sales were down. The saloon traffic from traveling crews was down. 3 businesses in Blackstone Crossing had mentioned cautiously that their own incomes were affected by the reduction in traffic, and 2 of them had said Whitlock's name in the same breath. He had, for the first time in a long time, made a decision whose consequences he could not contain, and the consequences were running. He was not a man who accepted this gracefully. He tried 2 more legal gambits through November, a challenge to the water rights on the creek that ran through the northern edge of the property, and a complaint to the county about the station signage on the freight road. Both failed, the first because the water rights had been correctly established as part of the original land registration, the second because no county ordinance covered freight road signage in any way that applied to what Summit Haven had posted. Both attempts went on Sheriff Pruitt's record because Bridget Rowan had asked him directly, on the 3rd week of October, to note any legal actions initiated against their property, and he had agreed to it with the particular look of a man who understood the full context of the request. Pruitt had in fact done something with the original report from the night of the attempted fire. Something quiet, something that didn't have Edgar Whitlock's fingerprints on it directly, but that made 3 separate people in the valley aware that there was a document with Edgar's name in it, and that the document was in a safe place. This was not justice, exactly. It was the particular kind of deterrence available to a law enforcement officer who knows the limits of what he can formally pursue, but not the limits of what he can informally arrange. Silas learned about it through a second-hand comment in November and did not discuss it with Whitlock, but felt, quietly, that Pruitt was a more complicated man than he had initially credited. In the 6th week, 2 things happened almost simultaneously. The first was that Deke Pruitt, who had been working on and off at the station since the beginning, asked Bridget if there was a full-time position. He had, over the months, become a reliable presence who knew the building better than anyone except Silas and Bridget, and who had at some unidentifiable point stopped thinking of himself as hired labor and started thinking of himself as something he didn't have a word for, but that showed up in how he treated the station's property and the guests who came through it. Bridget told him she'd pay him a fair wage, that he'd need to be available 6 days a week, and that if he talked to the guests the way he'd talked to her in the first week, she would end the arrangement without discussion. Deke said he understood. She hired him. His brother Warren took the news with a complicated expression, and then, the following week, asked for the same arrangement. Bridget hired him too, at slightly lower wages because his skills were narrower, and Warren accepted that without complaint in the manner of a man who had done some private reckoning about his own limitations. The second thing that happened in the 6th week was that a woman named Clara Hess arrived at Summit Haven Station with a wagon, 3 children, and a husband who had not survived the road from the Eastern Territories. She was not a traveler in the way of the freight crews. She was not moving through to somewhere else. She had run out of money 2 days south of Blackstone Crossing and had been making her way north on the remnants of it, and she had stopped at the station because it was the first lit building she had seen in 4 hours of driving in the dark, with her children asleep in the wagon bed. Bridget heard the knock on the door at 9:30 at night and opened it and looked at Clara Hess and at the 3 children behind her and at the hollow, fixed quality in the woman's eyes that is specific to people who have been holding themselves together by force of will, past the point where the will should have given out. She opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. She put Clara in one of the private rooms and the 2 older children in the adjacent room and the youngest, who was 4 and barely conscious. She carried in herself and put in the bed and covered. Clara Hess stood in the doorway of the room and watched this, and her face did something complicated that she didn't try to stop. Bridget said, "Sleep. We'll talk in the morning." "I can't pay for sleep," Bridget said. "We'll talk in the morning." Silas learned about it the next day and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. It was Bridget's station as much as his, and the decision was consistent with something that had been true about her since before he'd known her. Clara Hess stayed a week. She worked in the kitchen for her keep. She was a capable cook, it turned out, with a specific way with bread that was better than what they'd been producing. And Bridget noted this without false modesty and let her do it. By the end of the week, they had a quiet conversation in the kitchen about wages, and Clara stayed on. This was not in the business plan. Silas mentioned it once, sideways, and Bridget said, "We needed another cook," which was true, and she needed work, which was also true. And the combination of both true things produced a decision that was not sentimental, but was also not purely calculating, which was, Silas had come to understand, the characteristic register of most of Bridget's decisions. The winter came in hard in November, the way mountain winters do when they're serious about it. Not gradually, not with warning, but with the total commitment of a season that knows exactly what it is. The pass closed twice for 3-day stretches in November alone, which meant that caravans and travelers caught on the wrong side of the weather were not pushing through to Blackstone Crossing anymore because they couldn't. They were stopping at Summit Haven Station. The main hall, which Bridget had designed with a capacity of 20 in mind, had 31 people in it on the worst night of the first November storm, and it held them. The fireplace did what it was supposed to do. The kitchen ran through the night. Silas moved through the stable every 2 hours checking the animals because cold at that altitude at night is not something you assume is fine without checking. Deke and Warren Pruitt managed the hall with a competence that had nothing to do with grace and everything to do with simple, effective attention to what needed doing. In the morning, when the storm broke, a freight boss from a southern outfit sat across from Bridget in the office and said, "You saved my cargo last night. I'm not talking about just the weather." She looked at him. "Temperature dropped to something I don't want to put a number on," he said. "If we'd been on the road, I'd have lost 2 horses minimum, probably more." He paused. "You charged me fair rates." "Those are our rates," she said. "Other places double when they've got you cornered," he said. "You didn't." "That's not how we run things here." He nodded slowly. He put his payment on the ledger and then added something extra and pushed it toward her. "That's not for the service," he said. "That's for running a place worth coming back to." She looked at the extra amount. She looked at him. Then she entered it in the ledger under gratuity, declined, pushed it back across the desk and said, "The regular rate is what we charge. Come back next time you're through the pass." He stared at her. Then he took the money back with an expression that was not quite comprehension, but was moving in that direction. He shook her hand at the door. When he was gone, Silas was standing in the main hall doorway. "You could have kept it," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I didn't." He thought about that for a moment. He understood it, even if he might have decided differently himself. What she was building, what they were building, was not just a business in the transactional sense. It was a reputation for the kind of consistency that doesn't bend based on what you can get away with. And that kind of reputation was built precisely in moments when the bending would have been easy and unnoticed. It would pay itself back. He knew that. She knew it too. By December, Summit Haven Station was the primary way station on the entire mountain corridor. This was not an overstatement and not a projection. It was simply a fact established by the traffic count, by the accounts ledger, by the increasing reality that the road through the Northern Territories now had, at its midpoint, a reliable place to stop. Miners, ranchers moving cattle to southern markets, freight outfits of every size. A government survey crew in November, 2 lawyers traveling to a land dispute hearing, a circuit preacher who never preached at the station, but who ate Bridget's bread with the reverence appropriate to its quality. They all came through, and almost all of them came back. On a Tuesday in mid-December, Silas went into Blackstone Crossing for the first time since October. He needed a specific type of iron hardware that the Merritt's Fork suppliers didn't carry, and there was only one blacksmith in the valley who made it right. He rode in on a clear, cold morning and conducted his business efficiently and was almost back to his horse when he passed Edgar Whitlock's dry goods store. He didn't intend to stop. He had no reason to stop. But through the window he could see that the store was less full than it had been in March. The shelves had gaps. The 2 men he could see inside were not freight crew. They were locals, shopping for small domestic needs, which was a very different kind of business than the commercial traffic that had once moved through that store. Edgar Whitlock himself was standing behind his counter. He looked older. Silas noticed that. Not dramatically. Not the kind of change you see in a man who has been ill, but the particular aging of someone who has been under sustained pressure of a specific kind, the kind that comes from watching something you thought you controlled continue to move beyond your reach. Edgar saw Silas through the window at the same moment. Their eyes met through the glass for about 3 seconds. Silas looked at him the way you look at a landscape feature, acknowledging, without particular emotion, that it is there. Then he took his hardware package and went to his horse and rode back up the mountain. When he told Bridget that evening, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How did he look?" "Tired," Silas said. She absorbed that without comment. She stirred the pot on the kitchen stove and didn't say anything for a while, and what was on her face was not satisfaction exactly, and not pity either, but something in between. The complicated expression of someone who has been hurt enough by a person to feel the pull of both things at once. "Business is good," she said finally. "It is," he said. "Clara's bread is nearly as good as mine now." "Better in some ways." She looked at him. "Don't push it." He almost smiled. The kitchen was warm and the smell of the stew was good, and outside the wind was making its usual December argument with the mountain, and in the main hall Warren Pruitt was making some kind of joke that made 2 of the freight drivers laugh. A real laugh, the way people laugh when they're warm and fed and safe. Bridget listened to that laugh come through the wall for a moment, and then she went back to stirring the pot. It was a small moment. It would not appear in any account of what Summit Haven Station became, but something in it held the whole of what they'd built. Not the structure, not the business, not the reputation, but the actual thing underneath all of it, the original impulse, the thing Bridget had been carrying alone for 3 years on a worthless 50 acres while the town laughed. That there was a version of this life that was worth the cost of building it. She had been right about that, even when everything said otherwise, even when the laughing was loud and the debt was real and the ground was hard and frozen and the person who'd believed in her most was 3 years in the ground. She had been right. The second January storm came without much negotiation. The first one, in late December, had been the kind of storm that reminds people what mountains are actually capable of. 3 days of wind and snow that closed the pass completely and turned the freight road into something that existed only in memory. Summit Haven had moved through it without crisis, which itself was a kind of proof. The structure held. The fireplace held. The supplies held, barely, because Bridget had overstocked in November against exactly this contingency, and Silas had questioned the expense at the time and had not mentioned it since. But the second storm, the one that came in the second week of January, was different in character. It arrived faster than the sky gave warning for, and it came with a particular sustained intensity that suggested it had no interest in being brief. By the second morning, the snow at the station's front step was past knee-height and still building, and the freight road from the pass had ceased to be a road in any practical sense, and had become simply a direction in which the snow was deeper than it was in other directions. 11 travelers were stranded at the station when it closed in, 2 freight crews who had made it down from the pass just ahead of the storm's leading edge, a rancher named Obese, who was moving 3 horses south to a sale that would clearly not happen on schedule, and a young couple named Garrett and Mina Foss, who had been traveling from the Eastern Territories and who had the particular deer-in-headlights quality of people who had severely underestimated what a mountain winter looked like up close. The station managed them. That was the word for it. Not gracefully, not without friction, because 11 people confined in a space during a sustained storm will generate friction regardless of the quality of the shelter. Osby's horses needed more attention than the stable was designed for. One of the freight crew had a chest cold that worsened on the second day, and that Bridget managed with the limited medical knowledge she had, which was more than most people had, and less than was ideal. Young Mina Foss cried quietly on the second evening, not from any single thing but from the accumulated weight of displacement and uncertainty, and Bridget sat with her for 20 minutes in the office, and said things that were not reassuring in the false sense, but were honest in a way that turned out to be more useful than reassurance. Silas managed the outside work, checking the roof load every 6 hours, keeping the path to the stable clear, monitoring the creek for ice backup that could affect the water supply. He did this with the systematic focus of a man who has survived enough mountain winters to know that the ones you lose are the ones where you stopped paying attention before the storm decided it was done with you. On the third morning, the storm broke, and 3 hours after it broke, Edgar Whitlock appeared at the door of Summit Haven Station. Silas saw him first, from the upper window where he'd been checking the roof condition. He stood at the window for a moment looking at the figure on the front step, and then he came downstairs without hurrying. Bridget was in the kitchen with Clara when he came through. "Whitlock's at the door," he said. Clara stopped what she was doing. Bridget turned from the stove with a spoon in her hand and looked at Silas with an expression that was completely unreadable for about 3 seconds. Then she said, "I'll get it." She went to the front door and opened it. Edgar Whitlock looked nothing like the man who had stood in Cal Dunbar's saloon in March, with a debt notice between his fingers and a room full of people ready to laugh on his behalf. He had been outside in residual storm conditions for what looked like several hours. His coat was packed with snow along the shoulders, and the hat he was wearing was doing very little for him at this point. And his face had the gray, stripped-down quality of someone who has been cold for long enough that cold has stopped being a sensation and started being a condition. He was alone, no intermediary, no hired presence, just him. He looked at Bridget in the doorway, and something moved through his expression that was not simple to categorize. It wasn't shame, exactly, or maybe it was, but it was the specific shame of a man who has been proud long enough that the feeling is unfamiliar and therefore doubly uncomfortable. It was not a performance. That was the thing about it that Bridget noticed first, because she had seen Edgar Whitlock perform contrition before, in commercial negotiations, in public interactions where appearing reasonable served his interests, and this was not that. This was a man who was cold and beaten and had nowhere else to go. "Mrs. Rowan," he said. His voice had less in it than usual. She looked at him for a moment. She was aware of Silas standing about 10 feet behind her, not intervening, not prompting, just there, in the particular way he had of being present without intruding on something that belonged to someone else. She was also aware of the spoon still in her hand, which was absurd, and she held it anyway. "Mr. Whitlock," she said. He didn't ask. He didn't beg. He stood there in the snow-packed coat and said, "I need shelter." She looked at him steadily. Something was working through her that was not one thing. It was several things at once, moving in different directions. And anyone who has spent time with real human emotions rather than the simplified version of them would have recognized the specific quality of that look. The history was in it. The debt notice slammed on the counter, the lamp oil against the base of her walls, the years of remarks and sidelong looks, and the particular way a whole town had decided she was a joke before she'd had a chance to be anything else. All of that was in the look. He saw it. He didn't flinch from it, which was the first thing she could honestly credit him for. She stepped back from the door. "The rate is the same as it is for everyone," she said. "Room and meals, payable in advance for the first night." He came inside. She did not make it easy for him in any way except the essential one. She gave him the shelter he needed at the price that was fair. She didn't seat him separately from the other guests or draw attention to who he was. She didn't ignore him either. She treated him with the same brisk, functional consideration she extended to every traveler who came through that door, no more and no less. She brought his food when it was ready. She answered the one question he asked about how long the road south would take to clear with the same honest uncertainty she'd given to everyone else. Silas said almost nothing to him. He passed through the main hall twice on the first day on station business and acknowledged Whitlock's presence each time with a nod that was neither hostile nor warm, simply the nod of a man who sees someone and has nothing in particular to say to them. Osby the rancher had no idea who Whitlock was. The Fossey couple didn't either. The freight crews might have had some sense of it from valley gossip, but if they did, they kept it to themselves, which was the correct instinct. On the second evening, with the road still impassable, and most of the other travelers settled into the resigned patience of storm-stranded people who have accepted their situation and made their peace with it, Edgar Whitlock was sitting alone at the end of one of the hall benches when Bridget came through with coffee. She filled his cup without being asked. He watched her do it. Then he said quietly, not quietly for the room's benefit, just actually quiet, "You didn't have to let me in." She picked up the coffee pot. "Yes, I did," she said. "That's what we run here." He was silent for a moment. "You know what I tried to do to this place." "I do." "And you let me in anyway." "I let you in at the fair price," she said. "Same as everyone. If you're expecting something more than that from me, Mr. Whitlock, you're going to be disappointed." He looked at his cup. Something worked through his face that she didn't try to name. "I didn't expect anything," he said. and there was a specific weight to those words that suggested he meant them in more than one sense. She looked at him for a moment. The man who had held her debt like a weapon, who had sent men with oil cans to destroy what she'd built, who had spent the better part of a year working through every lever he could reach to break her and Silas before they could prove that everything he believed about them was wrong. He was 61 years old, and he was sitting at the end of a bench in a building he'd tried to burn, being served coffee by the woman he'd held in contempt since before her husband was cold in the ground. And there was nothing left in his face of the man who had enjoyed himself in Cal Dunbar's saloon on a March morning. "The pass will be clear in 2 days," she said. "South Road probably the day after." She picked up the coffee pot and moved on to the next person who needed a refill. She did not look back. Silas was in the kitchen doorway when she came through. He had heard enough. She set the coffee pot on the stove and stood with her hands flat on the work surface and breathed for a moment, which was the closest she came, in front of anyone, to showing how much that had cost. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. Then, after a pause, "No, not entirely." "That's fair." She straightened up. "I keep waiting to feel like I won something," she said. "He's sitting in there beaten, and I keep waiting for the part where that feels the way I thought it would feel." "How did you think it would feel?" She was quiet for a moment. "Bigger," she said. "I thought it would feel bigger." Silas was quiet for a while too. Then he said, "I think it's supposed to feel exactly like this." She looked at him. "Like you did the right thing and it was hard," he said. "And the person it was right toward doesn't necessarily deserve it, and it doesn't change the past, and tomorrow it's still just another day of work." He met her eyes. "That's what it actually feels like. The bigger version is in the story people tell afterward." She held his gaze for long enough that it meant something neither of them had to articulate. Then she nodded once, picked up the ladle for the stew pot, and went back to work. Edgar Whitlock left on the third morning when the South Road was clear enough to travel. He settled his account at the desk, 2 nights and meals, the fair price, no words about it, and picked up his coat and hat. At the door he stopped. Bridget was at the desk. She looked up. He opened his mouth to say something and then appeared to think better of whatever it was, or perhaps couldn't find the version of it that was honest enough to be worth saying. He put his hat on and walked out into the cold morning and didn't look back. And she watched through the window as he made his way down the front path toward the road and then was gone around the first bend. She sat at the desk for another minute. Then she opened the ledger and made the entry for his account and moved on to the next item of the day's business. It was not forgiveness, what she'd done. Not in the simple sense of the word. It was something more complicated and more durable. The decision that dignity was not something she was willing to withhold from a person simply because they had withheld it from her, because she had not built this place on the logic of withholding, and she was not going to start now because the target was convenient. That was the principle underneath everything, and it had cost her something real to hold to it, and she held to it anyway. Spring came the way mountain springs come. Not gently, not as a gift, but as a hard-won thing that the landscape yields only after you've proven you can survive without it. The snow came off the upper slopes in stages through March. The pass road opened in sections over 2 weeks, and the freight traffic that had been throttled by January and February came back with the particular compressed energy of commerce that has been delayed and knows it. Summit Haven Station received, in the first week of April, more traffic in 7 days than it had received in its first full month of operation. Bridget had anticipated this, had prepared for it through February while the storms kept the road closed, restocking the kitchen, having Silas and Deke reinforce the stable to add 4 more stalls, working with Clara on a simplified menu that could serve more people faster without losing the quality that had become the station's signature. The simplified menu was Clara's idea. Bridget had resisted it initially on the grounds that quality was not something to compromise for speed, and Clara had pointed out, patiently and correctly, that serving 40 people good food was better than serving 20 people exceptional food and making the other 20. Wait so long they stopped feeling good about it. Bridget had conceded the point, which had become easier, not easy, but easier, over the months of working with people who were good at what they did. By April, it was clear that they needed to make a decision about expansion. The problem was not optional. The station had outgrown its original design not because the design was wrong, but because the reality had exceeded the projection, which was the best possible version of the problem, but was still a problem. The 6 private rooms were full most nights. The main hall bench capacity was being exceeded on high-traffic evenings. The stable was at capacity on busy nights, and the overflow was managed by roping horses to a post line outside, which worked in good weather and was an actual problem in bad weather. Silas put the expansion options on paper one evening, 3 different configurations, each with different cost and timeline implications, and laid them in front of Bridget at the office desk. She read through all 3 carefully. He sat across from her and let her read without interruption, which was something he had learned to do early and that had not always come naturally. When she was done, she said, "The second option." He had thought she'd say the third, which was the most ambitious. He said, "Why the second?" "Because the third requires us to carry debt for 18 months, and we've been debt-free for 4 months, and I don't want to go back to carrying debt just because we can." He thought about that. It was conservative in the way that people who have been in real financial danger tend to be conservative, not timid, but calibrated to a specific memory of what it costs. "The second option doesn't add rooms," he said. "It adds stable capacity and it adds kitchen capacity," she said, "which are the 2 actual constraints right now. The rooms can wait until summer, when we know what the spring traffic numbers actually look like, rather than what we project them to look like." He looked at her for a moment. "You're right," he said. "I know." She pushed the papers back across the desk. "Draw it up." He almost smiled. She caught it. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You've gotten worse to argue with." "I was always this bad," she said. "You just didn't know me well enough at the start to notice." He drew it up. They broke ground on the expansion in the second week of April with the Pruitt brothers and 2 new workers they'd hired over the winter. A carpenter named Joel, who had heard about the station from a freight crew and had come looking for work in February with good references and a practical directness that Bridget had approved of on first conversation, and a young man from Merritt's Fork named Sam, who was not yet skilled but was genuinely willing, which was sometimes harder to find than skill. The expansion was less dramatic than the original build, which made it, in some ways, harder. The original build had been driven by something beyond practical calculation. The specific fuel of 2 people proving something against active opposition, the high-stakes clarity of a project that had to succeed because the alternative was unthinkable. The expansion was just work. Necessary, correctly planned, well-executed work, and there was no audience for it except the guests, who occasionally watched from the front step, and who mostly just wanted to know when the new stable stalls would be ready. Silas had thought he might miss the earlier intensity. He found, to his mild surprise, that he didn't. What he had instead was something quieter and more sustainable, the satisfaction of work that built on something that had already proven itself, the particular pleasure of a problem you know how to solve because you solved a harder one to get here. He found Blackstone Crossing itself increasingly irrelevant, which was its own kind of resolution. The town had, through the winter, undergone its own adjustment to the new reality of the mountain corridor. Some businesses had adapted. The provisions merchant who had partnered with Bridget early was doing well, since Summit Haven's traffic had actually expanded the regional economy, even as it rerouted some commerce away from Blackstone Crossing's center. Other businesses had not adapted and were showing the strain. Edgar Whitlock's dry goods operation had contracted significantly by spring. He was still in business. He had enough capital reserves and long-standing relationships to survive a bad year. But he was a smaller presence in the valley than he had been, and more importantly, he was a quieter one. The confidence had gone out of his public manner, or perhaps more accurately, the performances that had substituted for confidence had become too expensive to maintain. He did not come back to Summit Haven Station. In April, Silas heard through a contact in the valley that Whitlock had met with a lawyer about a possible sale of the dry goods business. He told Bridget. She said, in the tone of someone receiving information that is relevant but not personally urgent, and went back to what she was doing. On a Wednesday in the middle of May, the mountain did what mountains occasionally do, and served up a day that was so clear and warm and specific in its beauty that it felt almost like an argument against everything that came before it. The snow was off all but the highest ridges. The creek was running full and fast with meltwater. The freight road was dry and firm, and the traffic moving on it had the ease of a season that was finally, genuinely open. Silas was on the upper slope in the afternoon, checking a section of the property line fence that had shifted over winter, when he looked down at the station below him and saw what it was. Not in the abstract. He knew what it was, had known for months. But in the particular visual fact of it on a clear afternoon, the building standing solid and honest against the slope, the stable extension they'd added, the smoke from the kitchen chimney, the 3 wagons in the yard. Deke Pruitt's voice carrying up the slope in fragments as he said something to a traveler. The whole of it, assembled from nothing and rocky ground and a handshake in a saloon while a room full of people laughed. He stayed on the upper slope for a while, not doing nothing. The fence needed checking, but in the way of a person who has learned slowly and at some cost that some moments are worth staying in past the point of practical necessity. He came back down in the late afternoon. Bridget was in the office doing the accounts, which was a thing she did every Wednesday and Saturday without exception, because the books were the foundation of everything and she treated them accordingly. He knocked on the open door frame. She looked up. "Fence is good," he said. "Good." He came in and sat in the chair across the desk, not because there was anything specific to discuss, just because it was where he sat when there was something that needed saying and he was still working out what it was. She waited. She had learned to wait. He had learned that she would. "I've been thinking about the north quarter of the property," he said finally. "The timber up there is better than what we used in the build. If we take it selectively, not clear-cutting, just the mature spruce, we could sell the lumber to the mill in Merritt's Fork. It's additional income and it opens the ground for a garden," she said. He stopped. "I was going to say for better pasture access from the stable." "I know what you were going to say." She set down her pen. "I want a kitchen garden on the north quarter. Real vegetables, not just what we can buy from the Merritt's Fork suppliers. Clara agrees we need it." He looked at her. "That's a lot of work." "Most things worth having are." He sat with that for a moment. Then, "Both. Selective timber on the upper section, garden on the lower north quarter." She picked up her pen again. "Write it up," she said. "I'll look at it this weekend." He stood up to leave and she said, without looking up from the ledger, "Silas?" He stopped. She kept writing for a moment. Then she said, "I've been thinking about the partnership agreement." He was quiet. "We've been operating on a handshake for 14 months, she said. She still hadn't looked up. "I think we should put it in writing, properly, with a lawyer." He waited. "Equal shares," she said, "same as the handshake. But in writing, so there's no ambiguity about what either of us has built here and what either of us is owed for it." Now she looked up. "I'm not suggesting anything has changed. I'm suggesting we protect what we've built the same way we protect everything else we care about keeping." He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about March and the saloon and the room full of laughter and the 50 acres that nobody wanted, and the two of them on this slope in the cold with a handshake and no particular reason to trust anything except the quality of what they'd each seen in the other person. "I'll find a lawyer in Merritt's Fork," he said, "one that Whitlock doesn't know." Something moved through her face that was as close as she got to openly pleased. "Good." He went to Merritt's Fork on a Friday and came back with a lawyer named Aldous Marsh, who was dry and thorough and who drew up a partnership agreement over 2 sessions at the office desk that said, in the careful language of legal documents, what the handshake in Dunbar's saloon had already established: equal shares, equal say, equal stake in everything that had been built and everything that would be built going forward. They signed it on a Tuesday morning with Deke Pruitt and Clara Hess as witnesses. It was not a ceremony. They did it at the office desk before the day's work began, and Marsh packed his papers and left, and Deke went back to the stable and Clara went back to the kitchen, and Silas and Bridget were alone in the office for a moment with the signed document between them on the desk. She looked at it. He looked at her. 14 months ago you walked into a saloon, she said. I did. You had no reason to do what you did. I had reasons, he said. I thought the land was valuable. That's not why you did it. She met his eyes. Not challenging, just accurate, the way she was about most things. You did it because you saw something worth seeing, and you had the capital to act on it, and you had nothing particular to lose. He held her gaze. That's most of it, he said. What's the rest? He thought about it the way he thought about most things, actually thought about it, without rushing. I was tired of watching things get decided by the loudest room, he said. I'd been doing that for a long time, just watching. He paused. You were the first thing in a long time that made me want to stop watching. The office was quiet. Outside, a wagon was pulling into the yard, the driver calling to his team. The creek ran fast below the property line. Somewhere in the kitchen, Clara was singing something tuneless and cheerful that floated through the walls without quite resolving into a melody. Bridget looked at the signed document on the desk. Then she picked it up, folded it with the particular precision she brought to everything, and put it in the lockbox where the important papers lived. "We should open up," she said. "There's a caravan coming in from the south." He stood up. "I'll check the stable." She went to the front door and opened it, and the May morning came in. Not pretty, exactly, just real. Just the actual mountain morning, with its smell of thaw and pine and clean cold water, and the wagon in the yard and the driver climbing down from the box and looking at the station the way travelers looked at it when they arrived for the first time. "You looking for shelter?" she said. The man looked at her. He looked at the building. "What are you charging?" "Fair rates," she said. "Come inside." He came inside. The mountain pass would see plenty more winters, and some of them would be worse than the ones that had already come. There would be more problems, the kind you plan for and the kind you can't. The partnership would have its frictions, because two people who are both right about most things will always have frictions, and neither of them would have wanted it smoothed out in a way that required pretending otherwise. But the thing that the laughter in Dunbar's saloon had predicted, the inevitable, obvious, certain failure of a crazy mountain man and a woman the town had already written off. That thing had not happened, and was not going to happen, and the people who had been so sure about it had already stopped talking about it, the way people stop talking about predictions once it's clear the predictions were wrong. The mountain didn't care about any of that. It was a mountain. It just stood there, the same as it always had, while the people at its foot worked out what they were worth. But Summit Haven Station stood on it now, solid and imperfect and real. And Bridget Rowan's name was on the deed and on the partnership agreement and on the ledger and over the door, right where it belonged.